and welcome to our instructional strategy session video. This strategy session focuses on scaffolding inquiry with secondary students. In the session, we're going to hope to accomplish three things. First, we're going to review the purposes of scaffolding in an inquiry, get kind of a high-level look at how scaffolding works. We're going to focus on some different ways to scaffold students' work through the task in an inquiry, and generally speaking, just how to do scaffolding. And then we're going to examine a specific tool called SCIMC. The hope that you'll find has a lot of application for inquiry. We'll have some examples, of course, along the way. So let's get going. We'll start, of course, with the inquiry design model. That's our context. Inquiry design model lays out an approach to inquiry. It's an approach that moves students through a series of tasks, and as students are completing these tasks, they're engaging sources. The work with sources is complex work. They'll be working with disciplinary sources, and so scaffolds become very important. Scaffolds help novices do complex and difficult work. As you know, we have a path for designing IDM or inquiry. Using IDM, and this path takes teacher designers through a series of activities and a series of things that are done to build a blueprint. And so this graphic kind of lays that out, and I've bracketed all 10 parts of the process because really sources and scaffolding relates to the entirety of an inquiry, and it should always be in your mind when you're designing an inquiry, and of course it should be something that you're ready to do with your students when you start to implement that inquiry. So that'll be our focus, implementing the inquiry. And we're going to start here with reviewing the purposes of scaffolding in an inquiry. Now I do want to remind you all that, or I guess maybe just tell you if you haven't thought about this, there's really two sides to scaffolding an inquiry when you're a teacher. On one side is students and supporting students as they build their knowledge. On the other side is you as a teacher designing an inquiry and trying to implement an inquiry. IDM is an approach for designing inquiry, and thus it's a scaffold. It scaffolds you as a designer to move through that process that I just showed you on the previous slide, or a couple slides ago. What we're going to be talking about now in this video is building knowledge and supporting and scaffolding students as they build their knowledge during the implementation of the inquiry. This is really about moving IDM to classroom practice, to inquiry practice, and implementation. Now, as we shift to the classroom, for the purposes of scaffolding, we need to be really explicit about what we want sources to do, and then be equally explicit about how students work with them and how we work with them with our students. This is a quote from Ashby about sources and working with sources, and really kind of gets at the importance of scaffolding. Sources yield evidence, but only when they are used as such to support a claim, back up a theory, establish a fact, or generate a hypothesis. And so sources get us something. They get us evidence, and then we put evidence to work supporting a claim. And those claims do really important things. So this is complex work. You can see there's three things moving around here that kids have to tend to, and that's why scaffolds become so important. What is scaffolding? They are instructional techniques used to move students towards deeper understanding and greater independence in the learning process. So scaffolds become very important, and they're a critical part of the process of supporting students in the doing of their inquiry. Scaffolds are explicit and intentional, and it's really important to be explicit in the use of scaffolds and to be intentional. By explicit, I mean, you know, as a teacher in the classroom, you're making it very clear to students that you're scaffolding their work. They're very aware of what they're doing. So if they're at a point where they're working with a source and the task before them is to figure out something about who made the source, the maker of the source, they know that that's what they're doing, and they know that that's part of tending to kind of the contextual information or the summary information related to the source. And they're aware that they're doing a type of historical thinking. Intentionality comes in your sort of decisions about how to implement. So you use scaffolds at a particular place in time because you believe that students need them, because you believe that they are engaging in something that's particularly complex and difficult, and they may not have everything they need in place. There could be other times when you feel like the scaffold is not as is important. And so you lighten up the scaffold, back up a little, or maybe don't even use it. Scaffolding and inquiry are like hand in glove. If you look across the skills of inquiry, these are very generalized. Asking questions, locating sources, and using sources, of course, seeking evidence, making inferences, identifying perspectives, and corroborating information. All of those things are hard to do for novices, and thus all of them require scaffolding. All of these things require teachers on some level to be intentional about using a scaffold and then explicit with students in terms of helping them understand what it is that they're doing. Scaffolding is important before an inquiry, during an inquiry, and really after an inquiry. It needs to be around all the time because ultimately scaffolds are helping kids think about their thinking. And we need to be doing that all the time. We as teachers need to think about how we help our students learn so that they can be aware of what they're doing. Scaffolds create access at all times, not just an inquiry. They create access to things that are complicated and difficult perhaps to understand for novices. I'm going to talk about this later, but it's really important to build up scaffolds in front of students and to be public about that. So as a teacher, you can explain something publicly, you can demonstrate something, and then you have the kids participate. And that's a sequence of things that you do over and over and over to really bring students into the complexity of the work that we want them to do. And of course, we always want our classrooms to be in a climate of collaboration and cooperation. And it's really important to do that when scaffolding so that students are able to distribute their knowledge and share the work that they're doing. So this is just one little simple place to start. This is a scaffold, but it's a really simple one, something you could do at any time. It may be something that you've already done. And in this, what we're doing is we're scaffolding the complexity of really the concept of history and the notion of evidence in history and the importance of evidence. So what you do is you just get kids thinking about all the activities, all of your activities over this past weekend or through the day. So you just say to kids, all right, what have you been doing for the last day or over the last weekend or couple of days? They make a list, brainstorm a list of things that exist that would be like, material representations of what they've done. So it could be pieces of paper that they left around. It could be anything that they generated or produced. And so they make a list of that. They make a list of the things that are left. And what we're doing with students when we ask them to do that is we're sort of representing what happens in the work of history. Things are left behind from activities that occur, and then historians study those things. They're artifacts or pieces of information, things, relics and records of the past. So once kids have that list, they underline these items that might exist, and we can call it evidence. Those records, relics, the things, artifacts that are left behind, we can call them evidence. So you have them make a list, and you underline the things that might exist a month from now. Circle the things on that list that exist a year from now. Note the things that might exist 10 years from now. And what you're helping kids do is to understand the sort of impermanence of the moment and the difficulty in trying to recreate the moment the next day or a month from now or in a year or in 10 years. And they start to see that things disappear. And then they may start to become aware of this sort of reality that if we go back 10 years or 50 years or 100 or 1,000 years, how incredibly complex it is to recreate or to understand, because we're not going to recreate it, but to understand what happened at that time. Okay, so that's what scaffolding is in history and can do. Let's look at some different ways to actually scaffold students' work with sources in a task. And we're going to do some quick scaffolds that would support literacy and social studies and inquiry. And these are all the suggestion here with all of these is that these could be used in an inquiry, and I'll talk about where and how. The first thing we're going to look at is a strategic instructional model that comes out of a group at Kansas, and then a parts that comes from the College Board, and then just a general notion of visual discovery. And you see this visual discovery idea in a lot of places. First, a strategic instruction module. As I said, it's out of Kansas University. This really, take a look at this. Go to the URL. You're going to see an incredible number of very high quality research-based scaffolds, things that you can use with students to build up their literacy skills. They're general scaffolds. And so what I would suggest to you is to think about how you can use those in an inquiry strategically or intentionally, as I was saying before. You got a task in the inquiry. It's the second task on the second supporting question, and kids are doing something with the source, and it's particularly complex. Maybe they're reading a source. Well, there's some strategies in here that I think you could find that would scaffold students' task work, okay? And always keep in mind that you may need to explain that scaffold, demonstrate how it's used with some sample text, for example, and then have kids participate in the doing of the scaffold. I'm going to show you a couple of these. This is called a topic cue card, and I actually have 3 of these cue cards. This is a topic cue card, and the idea is that kids get a text or some source, they do some initial work, and then they produce a card, like a note card, and they write something on the note card. And this scaffolds their work with that source. Okay, so for a topic card, the initial work is just to find 1 or 2 words that tell what the source is about. Help kids understand that oftentimes that's located in the front, air quotes, of the source. So if it's text, it'd be early in the text. It may be foregrounded in a visual text. Oftentimes this kind of information is repeated. Sometimes it might even be found in a title. And once they've got those things, then on the topic cue card, they just say, this paragraph or whatever it is, a picture, whatever the source is about. And then they write down the 1 or 2 words. Now that sounds really simple, and you ought to be able to say to kids, what are the topic? Write it down. What's the topic? But sometimes they need some scaffolds and some support, and that's an example of how to do one on the topic. Now if you drill inside that source, you can get to the main idea. Even if you're sticking with the same source here, a main idea is what main idea is the big thing. It's what the paragraph's about. It's kind of summary level. And what you're trying to push kids to do is to get a general statement that summarizes the information in the paragraph. So they're going past the topic and expanding that. And the card would say something like, what does the paragraph, in this instance the paragraph is the source, what does the paragraph tell me about? Boom, fill in the topic. I'm sorry, that should say fill in the main idea. And then on the details cue card, that's another one, and it drills down even more in depth, trying to get details out of the source. Same kind of thing, initial work, trying to surface these more fine-grained pieces of information, specific information that's related to the main idea in the topic. And again, on the cue card, they just write down, this is what it is. Now I want to show you another one. This is another scaffold, and it deals with the same thing, topic, main idea, and details. But this time we're approaching it differently. They're going to see all of these ideas at once, topic, idea, and topic, main idea, and details. And then they go through a sequence. Find the topic, what's it about, this paragraph is about, 1 word. What's the main idea? Again, they're trying to drill in a little bit, better clarity, better depth. And so what they'd write is, it tells me, fill in the blank, and then details. 1 detail, another detail. Now, what's cool about scaffolds is you can move things around. So you could flip this from a T, M to D process to a D to MT process. And we just flipped it. We're going to start with the details. It's more inductive. They drill inside of it. They pull the details out, and then they work their way back to a topic. When you get kids to do that, what you're doing, if you flip it for them, do one source one way, the next source the other way, what you're doing is help them to become more fluent with this scaffold. And that's the goal. You want to create fluency with the scaffold so kids understand conceptually what details, main ideas, and topics are. And then they won't need the scaffolds eventually because they'll automatize it. They'll become experts, and they'll be able to find this stuff when they read. Then they can pick their speed up. They can do this quicker, and they can get more advanced. And that's our goal, in school, all the way from K to 12, to speed the process up so they become better. And really, ultimately, they're able to master these things that we're asking them to do. The College Board has a specific scaffold. This is different than what I just showed you. The things that I just showed you were kind of strategies, and again, you can go to SIM Strategic Instruction module and get a bunch of them and play around with them and make them your own and even invent your own. The College Board has this scaffold for doing document-based work with DBQs and history courses called a PARTS that many of you may know. And a PARTS is fairly complicated, but it's also very what we call a hard scaffold. It's meant to be used a certain way. So what you do with kids is you say, all right, you got a source. Now I want you to do these things with the source. I want you to answer these questions. It's very explicit. Tell me who the author is, who created it. Tell me the time and place. prior knowledge, audience, reason, main idea, significance. And so kids go through this and answer all these. And you can be super duper explicit with kids. This is what I want you to do. Answer these questions. And do it over and over and over, and they'll get better at it. Another thing you can do is visual discovery, because not all sources are going to be text. And as you've done these videos and participated in this PD, you know that in IDM we want to have variety in source type. And that's a very important part of the process in designing an inquiry, to make sure there's a variety in sources with regard to the type. But then once you do that, you got to help support kids as they work with these visual sources. Visual discovery, just like any scaffold, should be explicit and intentional. So let's take a look at one strategy. There's lots and lots of them, and you may have seen something like this, but this particular visual discovery is a zoom-in strategy. And in the zoom-in strategy, what you do is you show pieces. So the first piece, you can think of it as a puzzle. Show the second piece, and then complete the image. And along the way, what you're getting kids to do is to tend to the pieces of the puzzle, air quotes, or the visual. They're deconstructing it and doing analytical work, but you're scaffolding that support, that approach, that work on the part of students in a very careful way. So it could look something like this, okay? And you could give this to kids. What do you see? Say, just, what do you see? What's the tone? What do you see? And they might look at it and go, oh, I see dark stuff in a corner. Maybe that's a cloud. I don't know. Open a little more up. What new things do you see? Oh, I see something that looks like people on horses. Maybe they're Native Americans. I don't know. Maybe there's bison or something in the background. Okay, here's some more. You got a lot of information here, so make a hypothesis. What do you think's happening here? And what are the clues that would lead you to believe the things that you're saying? And kids might say things like, oh, this is a scene from the West. I think I see a covered wagon, so it must have been a long time ago. And maybe they're running away from something. Everybody looks like they're running. And maybe they're in a panic. Who knows? There's a storm. I don't know. So open up a little bit more. What do you see? There's some guys standing on a hill. Maybe they're the cause of concern. I don't know. Now there's even more. What do you think's happening? This is a painting. So you've told them it's a painting. Whoa, okay. It's getting kind of complicated. There's a train. There's telegraph wires. There's water. There's boats. There's people with a plow. Wow. Lots of stuff going on. Pull the rest of it away. Now what? And so kids start talking about what they see. They sort of work their way into this in a very structured way by the teacher, who's been very deliberate in scaffolding or laying this out in a particular way. And then you can start to ask different questions specifically about things that you see, like who or what could the woman in the middle represent. You could give students now some sourcing information. This is when it was produced. This is where you can find it online. This is what it was called. And then you start asking questions about, where do we go from here? What's in your mind now that you've done this analysis? Now I'll say, this is a strategy that you can use. Okay, so it's a general strategy. It can apply to a lot of different visual analysis. If you embed this inside an inquiry, this could be part of task work. So the task might be to write a paragraph summarizing the content of this photo or something else. The work that's done to get to the task, the scaffold, is what I just showed you. And that's something that's not built into IDM. The kind of stuff that we just went through is not built into IDM. That's stuff that teachers have to do. Teachers have to figure out how to support their kids, how to scaffold the work that their students are doing to get them to the point where they can be successful in completing the task. Okay? So here's a big question that could sit on top of the picture. All right, so now we're going to look at a specific strategy, and this is sort of like a parts, but sort of different. It's a very specific strategy that I would encourage all of you to use, and maybe some of you have seen it before. It's called SCIMC, and it's a tool that can support student learning and outcomes through scaffolding. And it really addresses this question: how do I design a scaffolded task? SCIMC is an explicit strategy instruction. It's developed by a fellow named David Hicks. He's a professor, a social studies professor at Virginia Tech, along with his colleagues, Peter Doolittle in educational psychology and Tom Ewing, who's a historian. They developed this strategy several years ago, and we've been using it. I've been using it. I've used it with teachers in Hawaii, and I want to kind of take you through the model. Now, what you see here is a lot of information. On the left is the scaffold, and the scaffold consists of 5 areas with 4 questions in each area. And so it can be a very explicit and hard scaffold where you give kids the actual questions, the 16 questions, give them a source and say, all right, answer these 16 questions. Or you could be a little less formal with it, and just kind of play around with it and do what you need to do with it. On the right-hand side is a visual representation of how the scaffold works. And the point that I would make about that, you see the 5 parts, summarizing, contextualizing, inferring, monitoring, and corroborating, is that there's a lot of interplay. It's very fluid, and it's okay for kids to bounce back and forth between things. So if you give them the 16 questions and they do the first one and then drop to the 5th one, it's okay. In fact, it's actually kind of cool because that's what you want to happen ultimately. You want kids to be fluid and to really automatize this process. So let's drill inside of it and look at the summarizing phase first. This is the summarizing phase. You're really examining a single source. When you summarize, you're looking for facts, details, and observations. You want kids to be really obvious at the summarizing stage, and these are the specific questions that you'd put in front of kids to answer. Okay? What type of source or what type of document is the source, etc. The second phase is contextualizing. So this is what contextualizing looks like. You're placing the source in time and in space. And again, there's 4 specific questions. When and where was the source produced? If students start to get more fluid with this and more expert-like, then they might not need the questions, but you might want to provide the questions anyway. And again, this can be done with any kind of source, text, visual, anything. The next thing is inferencing. And when you infer in history and social studies, that's really where the hard work is. It's the magic. It's where it happens. Because you're stepping away from the source and saying something you believe to be true. It's the process of beginning claim making. And so I would suggest that you can't make a claim, thus you can't do an argument and complete an inquiry unless you have the capacity and the skill of making an inference. An inference is when you say what's suggested, when you make an educated guess. And so those questions point to that. Those questions are explicit in that they're trying to get kids to do that with a source. So you read a source and then say, all right, what interpretations can be drawn from this? What perspectives are indicated by the source? Monitoring is a very important part of the process. And when you monitor, what you're doing is you're staying aware as a learner of your process. And you're asking questions over and over and over. And you're lingering. And so these are the kind of questions you can put in front of students that will prompt them to linger and to dig deeper and say, do I have everything I need to get out of this? And then the final phase is cooperating. Cooperating happens when you have another source, multiple sources across the sources. You cooperate to try and answer a question. And so cooperation is really driven by a question. Whether it's a supporting question or a compelling question is driven by the question and the encounter with multiple sources. So you begin to look at the similarities and differences that exist. In IDM and the inquiries developed with IDM, you'll see a lot of these types of tasks that require cooperation, where students are doing some kind of comparison or contrasting or trying to use multiple sources. And that should almost always be done in a summative task when students are making an argument. Hopefully they're going to have multiple pieces of evidence to support claims that come from multiple sources. So that's the model. Let's look at it. I want to use a visual, and this is one that we use a lot with folks. It's a visual from a newspaper, Richmond Times newspaper, October 21st, 1901. And it shows some characters that you may think are familiar. You may recognize them, and underneath the caption says, "Go way back and sit down." And so in this particular inquiry, we give this cartoon to students at the beginning of the inquiry. And the inquiry asks the question, why did President Roosevelt invite Booker T. Washington to dine at the White House? And so, as you might surmise now, this is Booker T. Washington and President Theodore Roosevelt sitting at the White House, and a cartoonist is illustrating some things about this as an editorial. And so you could put this in front of kids and you can say, what do you see? Hey, let's have a conversation. Or you could skim it. And we think skimming it is a good way to go because it starts to build up kids' strength and their capacity to do source work. The diagram that you see on the right the little concentric boxes, is just a way to graphically organize skim work. So you can see in the middle, is going to be summarizing as you build out, contextualizing, inferring, and monitoring. And so you could actually get some big chart paper or put it on the wall or however you want to do on a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and put the image in the middle and have kids write, and it might look like that. It's kind of crazy, a bunch of stuff written all over the place. And it would unfold, you know. So in summarizing, we'd say, what does the source tell us? Well, it tells us that this is a political cartoon, and kids can figure out that it's from a newspaper, and they can get the date, and they can say it's next to an article, and they can have the title of the article, and they can say there's 4 characters, a black man, a white man, they're seated at a table, there's a standing woman. And there's also another character you can't quite see because the image isn't big enough, and so on. And then they can contextualize. And when they contextualize, they might say more about the fact that this was in Richmond, or they might say that it was produced to suggest southern states were shocked to hear that Roosevelt had invited a black man to dinner, and other stuff. And you keep going. You can put some inferencing stuff in there. But all along, you're kind of weaving this all together. And you want to have a lot of robust discussions and have this be an active experience. I think it would be a mistake to give kids that graphic organizer and tell them to be quiet and work on this by yourself. You want there to be activity and discussion. And so these are some things that you could support that discussion with. Some types of push points that you might have. So all of this scaffold work is in support of you all implementing inquiries, and you can get the inquiries at c3teachers.org, and of course on your hub where this video is. Enjoyed spending some time with you in the video. If you have any questions, of course, please let me know, and you can get my contact information online. Thanks a lot.